She had exactly $283 to her name, and a daughter who hadn't eaten a real meal in days. But when a billionaire offered her $2,000 for a 4-hour miracle, she said no. She didn't know that by sunrise, 8 men in black suits would surround her shop to pay a debt that money couldn't touch. The rain didn't just fall in the heights. It hammered against the glass like a creditor looking for what was owed. Beatrice Anderson didn't look up from her machine. She couldn't afford to. The hum of her 1984 Singer was the only heartbeat her shop had left. She checked her phone. The screen was cracked, but the numbers were clear. $283.47. That was the sum total of her life's work. In 4 days, the rent was due, $950. On Friday, the lights would go dark if she didn't find $215. The math was a ghost that haunted her every waking hour. She was nearly $900 short of surviving another month. In the kitchen above the shop, her daughter, Maya, sat in a thick sweater because the heat was a luxury they could no longer afford. Beatrice watched her from the doorway. Maya was 14, brilliant, and wearing sneakers with toes pushing through the canvas. "Morning, baby." Beatrice forced a brightness into her voice that she didn't feel. She split 3 eggs between 2 plates, giving Maya the larger portion. She told her daughter she wasn't hungry, a lie she'd told so often it tasted like ash. On the counter sat a permission slip for science camp. $350. Beatrice looked at the college fund jar. $1,100 saved over 3 years. At this rate, Maya would be 40 before she saw the inside of a university. Beatrice walked downstairs and touched a yellowed newspaper clipping on the wall. "Local seamstress saves wedding day." Her mother's face smiled back at her. Her mother had once fixed a bride's dress for free, telling her, "You need a miracle today, not a bill." "I'm trying, Mama," Beatrice whispered to the empty shop. "But miracles don't pay the electric company." The phone rang. It was the final notice. Friday was the end of the line. Beatrice opened the register, $47. She spent her morning helping those even poorer than herself, charging Mrs. Lopez $10 instead of $15 and replacing a button for old Mr. Samuel for free. "You can't keep giving it away, child," Mr. Samuel warned. "You've got bills. If someone can see your struggle, you didn't carry it with enough dignity," she replied, her hands moving with practiced grace. By 8:58 p.m., the storm outside turned violent. Beatrice was finishing a $25 alteration when the knock came. It wasn't the knock of a customer. It was the sound of a man who had reached the end of the world. She opened the door to find a man soaked to the bone. His suit cost more than her car, but the shoulder was shredded, the lining hanging out like a broken wing. "Please," he gasped, his voice breaking. "I have the most important meeting of my life at 8:00 a.m. My luggage is lost. If I don't look professional, 300 people lose their jobs." Beatrice looked at the black town car idling at the curb. She looked at the man's terrified eyes. "Come in," she said. The man, who introduced himself only as Gregory, pulled out a wallet. He counted out bills, hundreds, 50s. "I have $2,000 right here," Gregory said, his hands shaking. "It's yours, just fix it." Beatrice stared at the money. It was the answer to every prayer. Rent, electricity, Maya's shoes, science camp. The math was finally solved. But then a photo fell from his wallet, a girl in medical scrubs. "My daughter, Caroline," he whispered. Beatrice thought of Maya sleeping upstairs. She thought of her mother's voice. She looked Gregory in the eye and pushed the $2,000 back across the table. "No," she said softly. Gregory froze. "But, you need it. I can see your bills on the desk." "I need it desperately," Beatrice said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. But my mama taught me something. When someone is drowning, you don't charge them for the rope. You throw it for free. Gregory sank into a chair, his face in his hands. He didn't know that Beatrice had just signed her own eviction notice to save his dignity. And Beatrice didn't know that the man sitting in her humble shop was worth $4.2 billion. She lit 2 candles as the power flickered and died. And for the next 4 hours, she worked in the shadows, stitching a future she thought she would never see. The darkness that swallowed the shop at 10:15 p.m. was absolute. It was the kind of blackness that makes a person forget where their body ends and the world begins. Gregory Ashford sat paralyzed in the wooden chair, the sudden silence of the city outside amplifying the pounding of his own heart. "Don't move," Beatrice's voice came through the gloom, as calm as a prayer. He heard the scrape of a drawer, the junk drawer that every person living on the edge keeps stocked for the inevitable. A match struck, a tiny spark of defiance against the night, and then the warm, flickering glow of 6 candles filled the room. Beatrice didn't sigh. She didn't complain about the power company. She simply moved the candles closer to her 1984 Singer and repositioned the ruined jacket. "How can you even see?" Gregory asked, his voice a whisper. He looked at her hands, rough, calloused, but steady. "My fingers remember," she said, her eyes narrowing as she threaded a needle by feel alone. "I've worked through hurricanes and blackouts. You learn that the light isn't in the ceiling, it's in your focus." For the next 3 hours, the billionaire watched a master class in survival. Every movement was a promise kept. She moved the needle through the fabric like a surgeon, reconstructing a shoulder seam that had been failed by cheap, industrial thread. "You're making it look like surgery," Gregory remarked, leaning forward into the candlelight. "It is surgery," Beatrice replied without looking up. "Just on fabric instead of people. If I mess up this stitch, the whole structure fails. My mama always said, if your name is on it, make it worthy of your name." Gregory's phone buzzed incessantly on the table. VP of Operations, the board chairman, his executive assistant. The titans of industry were screaming for his attention, but in this candle-lit sanctuary they were nothing but ghosts. He silenced them. "You're more than just an employee at that company, aren't you?" Beatrice asked, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain. He reached for his wallet one last time. He pulled out the stack, $2,500 in crisp bills, and laid them on the table. "You saved my life tonight," he said. Beatrice looked at the money. She thought of Maya's shoes. She thought of the final notice from the electric company. Her fingers twitched, moving toward the life-changing sum. Then she looked at the ceramic key on her desk and the photo of her mother. "No," she said, pushing the fortune back toward him. Gregory's eyes went wide. "Why? This is fair payment." "Because kindness isn't a transaction, Gregory," she said, her voice dropping to a low, serious rumble. "If I take this money, I'm just a tailor you hired. If I don't, I'm the woman who helped you when you were drowning. Go save those jobs. That's my payment." Gregory Ashford left the shop in tears, clutching a piece of paper with his name and phone number on it. He watched the small shop disappear in the rearview mirror of his town car. Beatrice locked the door and collapsed against it. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by the cold reality that she was still broke, still facing eviction, and still $900 short. She fell asleep at 1:47 a.m., believing she had done the right thing. But the world was already moving. While she slept, an email was being sent to 200 of the most powerful executives in the country. The subject line, "What I Learned in the Dark." Beatrice Anderson woke up to a sound she didn't recognize. It wasn't the rattling of her old pipes or the distant siren of an ambulance. It was a low, synchronized hum, the sound of high-performance engines idling in unison. She rolled out of bed, her joints stiff from the 4 hours she'd spent hunched over Gregory's jacket. She checked her phone. 7:45 a.m. The world outside was gray, but the street was anything but quiet. When she pulled back the moth-eaten curtain of her upstairs window, her heart skipped a beat. The narrow, potholed street of the Heights was lined with 8 identical black SUVs. They were polished to a mirror finish, looking like shards of obsidian dropped into a wasteland. Men in charcoal suits stood like statues beside the vehicles, their earpieces glinting in the morning light. "Maya, stay upstairs," Beatrice whispered, her voice tight with a fear she couldn't name. "Mom, who are they? Is it the police?" Maya asked, her face pale. "I don't know, baby. Just stay away from the window." Beatrice threw on her old cardigan, her fingers trembling as she buttoned it. She grabbed a heavy iron scissors from her sewing table, a meager defense, but she wasn't going down without a fight. She walked down the creaking stairs, every step feeling like a march toward a cliff. She unlocked the front door. The bell chimed, a lonely, cheerful sound in the heavy silence. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the doors of the SUVs opened simultaneously. It was a choreographed movement, silent and terrifying. 16 men stepped out. They didn't look like debt collectors. They didn't look like thugs. They looked like the men who own the world. One man, taller than the rest, with hair the color of steel, stepped forward. He held a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Beatrice's entire shop. "Beatrice Anderson?" he asked. His voice was devoid of emotion, professional and cold. "I don't owe you anything," Beatrice said, her grip tightening on the scissors hidden in her pocket. "If you're here about the rent, I have 4 days. That's the law." The man didn't smile. He reached into his pocket. Beatrice flinched, expecting a weapon or a legal notice. Instead, he pulled out a small, bone-white envelope. "My name is Julian Vane," he said. "I am the chief counsel for the Ashford Global Group. Mr. Gregory Ashford requested that I hand-deliver this to you before his 8:00 a.m. meeting." The name hit her like a physical blow. Gregory, the man from the storm, the man who had been soaked to the bone and shivering in her chair. Beatrice took the envelope. Her hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped it. She tore it open. Inside was no money. There were no checks. There was only a single high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of a boardroom, a massive mahogany table surrounded by men in suits who looked like they were made of stone. And at the head of that table stood Gregory. He was wearing the jacket. Beatrice could see the line of the shoulder she had reconstructed. It was perfect. He looked powerful. He looked like a king. Below the photo, a handwritten note. The meeting began at 8:00. At 8:01, I told them the story of a woman who saved a stranger when she had nothing left to give. I told them that if a woman in the Heights can have more integrity than a billion-dollar board, then we have a lot to learn about value. Look behind you, Beatrice. Beatrice turned. 2 of the men in suits were already moving. They weren't coming for her. They were carrying heavy crates toward her shop door. "What are you doing?" she cried out. "Orders from Mr. Ashford, ma'am," Julian Vane said. "He noted that your equipment was suboptimal for your talent." They pushed past her with practiced efficiency. Inside her tiny, dusty shop, they began to work. They didn't just bring supplies, they brought a transformation. Within minutes, her old, clacking singer was moved to a place of honor in the corner. In its place, they installed 3 industrial Juki sewing machines, the kind used in Parisian fashion houses. They brought rolls of fabric, silk from Italy, wool from Scotland, patterns that Beatrice had only ever seen in the dreams she was too tired to have. But it wasn't just the machines. A third man approached with a tablet. "Ms. Anderson, if you could just sign here. The deed to this building has been settled in full. You are no longer a tenant. You are the owner of the property and the 2 adjacent lots." Beatrice felt the air leave her lungs. She slumped against the brick wall of her shop. I told him I didn't want his money." "He knows," Julian Vane said, and for the first time a small ghost of a smile appeared on his face. "He said you wouldn't take a gift, so he didn't give you one. He gave you an investment. He's already booked your services for the next 3 years to handle the executive tailoring for his entire board. That's not a gift, Beatrice. That's a contract." He handed her a second document. "And this," Julian continued, "is for the girl upstairs, Maya, I believe." Beatrice looked at the paper. It was an acceptance letter to the St. Jude Academy of Science, the most prestigious private school in the state. At the bottom, a note: tuition, boarding, and travel paid in full by the Ashford Foundation, for the girl who deserves a miracle. Beatrice began to sob. Not the quiet, dignified sobs she had practiced for years, but a deep, racking release of every fear she had carried since her mother died. The neighbors were coming out now. Mrs. Lopez stood on her porch, jaw dropped. Mr. Samuel leaned on his cane, staring at the fleet of SUVs. They saw the woman they had known as a struggling seamstress being surrounded by the elite. But as the men in suits finished their work and returned to their vehicles, Julian Vane stopped at the door. "There's one more thing, Ms. Anderson," he said, checking his watch. "The 8:00 a.m. meeting is over. Mr. Ashford won. The jobs are safe." "I'm glad," Beatrice whispered, wiping her eyes. "He also mentioned one other detail," Julian said. "He said to tell you that he noticed the final notice on your desk last night. He didn't pay it." Beatrice blinked. "He didn't." "No," Julian replied. "He bought the utility company." The SUVs roared to life. In a cloud of exhaust and expensive silence, they vanished as quickly as they had arrived, leaving Beatrice standing in front of her own shop, the deed to her life in her hand. But as she turned to go inside, she noticed a black town car she hadn't seen before. The window rolled down. It wasn't Gregory. It was a woman with sharp eyes and a smile that looked like a weapon. "Beatrice Anderson?" the woman asked. "My name is Alina Thorne. I'm the editor-in-chief of Vogue. I just got an email from a very influential friend of mine. He told me I'm looking at the next great American couturier." The woman opened the door. "We have a lot to talk about, and I suggest you start sewing. You have a gala to dress in 3 weeks." Beatrice looked at her hands. The calluses were still there. The cracks in her skin were still there, but the math was finally gone. However, as Beatrice stepped back into her shop, she didn't see the machines or the fabric. She saw a small, red dot dancing on the wall of her shop, a laser sight. Someone wasn't happy about Gregory's new partnership, and someone didn't want the story of Beatrice Anderson to have a happy ending. Beatrice stood frozen. The red dot didn't move. It sat right on the center of her chest, a tiny, glowing eye that held the power of life and death. In that moment, the Italian silk and the high-tech sewing machines didn't matter. The deed to the building felt like a heavy stone in her hand. She realized that Gregory Ashford hadn't just given her a future. He had painted a target on her back. "Maya," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Get down now." The red dot suddenly danced away, flicking across the fabric rolls and disappearing out the window. Beatrice lunged for the light switch, plunging the shop back into the familiar darkness she had worked in just hours before. She crawled toward the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the street was quiet again. The town car with the Vogue editor was gone. The SUVs were gone, but parked across the street under the flickering amber glow of a dying street lamp was a motorcycle. The rider was clad in all black, their helmet a void of tinted glass. They weren't moving. They were just watching. "Mom, what's happening?" Maya's voice came from the stairs, trembling. "Stay away from the glass, Maya," Beatrice commanded, her voice regaining that steel-edged tone. She reached for her phone to call the number Julian Vane had left, but before she could dial, the phone buzzed in her hand. An unknown number. She answered. "Who is this?" "You should have taken the $2,000, Beatrice," a voice hissed. It wasn't Gregory. It was a voice that sounded like gravel grinding against metal, cold, clinical, and devoid of soul. "If you had taken the money, you would have just been another poor woman with a lucky night. But you chose to be a symbol, and symbols are meant to be broken." The line went dead. Beatrice didn't cry. She didn't shake. Instead, she felt a cold fury rising from her gut. This shop was her mother's legacy. This neighborhood was her home, and no man on a motorcycle was going to take that away. She realized that Gregory's win in the boardroom hadn't just saved 300 jobs, it had cost someone else a fortune. In the world of billionaires, there is no such thing as a clean victory. Every dollar Gregory saved was a dollar ripped out of the hands of someone more dangerous. The man who had been trying to bankrupt Gregory's company was Sterling Vance, a vulture capitalist known for dismantling lives for sport. By saving Gregory's image, Beatrice had accidentally dismantled Sterling's plan. She looked at the new machines. They were beautiful, but they were silent. She looked at her mother's old Singer. It was scarred and rusted, but it was a warrior. "They think I'm weak because I'm poor," Beatrice muttered to the darkness. "They think I'm easy because I'm kind." Suddenly, the front window shattered. A heavy brick wrapped in paper crashed through the glass, landing in the middle of the Italian wool. Beatrice shielded Maya as glass rained down like diamonds. She waited for the sound of an engine, for the sound of a door being kicked in. But there was only the receding roar of the motorcycle. She picked up the brick. The paper wasn't a note. It was a printed copy of her eviction notice, the one Gregory was supposed to have handled. Across the front, written in red ink, were the words, "The debt is still owed." It wasn't about the money. It was about the power. Sterling Vance didn't want the building. He wanted the Thorne family to stay in the dirt where he believed they belonged. "We can't stay here, Mom," Maya cried, clutching her mother's arm. "Let's call Mr. Ashford. He has bodyguards, he has power." Beatrice looked at the shattered glass and then at her daughter. "No, Maya. If we run to him every time a shadow moves, we aren't his partners. We're his pets. We don't need a billionaire to protect us. We need to show them what a woman from the heights does when she's pushed." Beatrice walked over to the new machines. She didn't call the police. She didn't call Gregory. Instead, she called Marcus, the neighborhood watch captain, and Mrs. Lopez and Mr. Samuel. "I need eyes on every corner of this block," she told them. "I need the cameras from the bodega pointed at my door. And Marcus, bring your brothers." By midnight, the shop was boarded up, but the lights were blazing. Beatrice wasn't sewing for Vogue anymore. She was sewing something else. She spent the next 6 hours working with a feverish intensity. She wasn't making a gown. She was taking the heavy, reinforced industrial fabric Gregory had sent, and she was lining it with something she'd found in the back of her mother's old supply trunk. Thin, flexible sheets of Kevlar her mother had once used to make vests for the local precinct. If Sterling Vance wanted a war, she would give him one. But she wouldn't fight with guns. She would fight with the truth. As she worked, she realized the final notice Gregory had seen wasn't just about electricity. It contained a list of every person in the neighborhood Sterling Vance had tried to buy out. He was trying to flatten the entire heights to build a luxury skyscraper. Gregory hadn't just bought the utility company. He had accidentally given Beatrice the keys to the entire neighborhood's survival. At 4:00 a.m., the motorcycle returned. This time there were 4 of them. They stopped in front of the shop, the engines growling like hungry wolves. The riders got off, carrying cans of gasoline. They thought the boards on the windows meant she was hiding. They thought the silence meant she had surrendered. They stepped onto the sidewalk, unscrewing the caps of the cans. The smell of fuel filled the air. But before they could pour a single drop, every street lamp on the block turned on at once. The floodlights Beatrice had installed on the roof flared to life, blinding the riders. And then, the doors to the surrounding houses opened. Dozens of people stepped out, not with weapons but with phones. Every single one of them was recording. Every single one of them was a witness. Beatrice stepped out of her front door, wearing a simple black coat, the one she had reinforced. She looked at the men in the helmets. "This is my neighborhood," she said, her voice echoing off the brick walls, deep and resonant. "And every single person you see is streaming this live to the Ashford Global Network. If you drop those cans, the whole world sees your faces when those helmets come off." The riders froze. They looked at the crowd. They looked at the cameras. They were professional cleaners, and professionals don't like to be seen. "Tell Sterling Vance," Beatrice said, stepping closer until she was inches from the lead rider's visor. "The debt isn't owed to him. It's owed to the people he tried to erase, and we're coming to collect." The lead rider looked at the sea of phones, at the unbreakable woman standing in the light, and realized he had lost. Without a word, they mounted their bikes and sped away into the night. Beatrice stood in the middle of the street, the cold morning air hitting her face. She had won the first battle, but as she looked at the reflection of her shop in the puddles on the ground, she knew the real war was just beginning. Sterling Vance was a billionaire, and billionaires don't like to be told no twice. The invitation arrived not on paper, but in a black velvet box. Inside was a single card, gold embossed, the Metropolitan Unity Gala. It was the night where the old money of the city gathered to decide the fate of the new world. Gregory Ashford was the guest of honor, but the name at the bottom of the guest list, the one causing whispers from Wall Street to the Heights, was Beatrice Anderson. For 3 days, Beatrice didn't sleep. She didn't work on the Vogue gowns or the corporate uniforms. She worked on herself. She stood in her shop, now shielded by a new glass window, looking at the fabric she had chosen. It wasn't the Italian silk Gregory had sent. It was a heavy midnight blue cotton, woven with metallic threads that caught the light like stars in a dark sky. It was the fabric of the working class, elevated to the level of royalty. "You look like a queen, Mom," Maya said, standing in the doorway. Beatrice looked at her reflection. The dress was architectural, sharp angles, hidden pockets, and a collar that stood high like armor. Underneath the elegance, the lining was the same reinforced material she had used to face down the bikers. She wasn't just going to a party, she was walking into a lion's den. As the town car pulled up to the red carpet of the Grand Palace Hotel, the flashes of the cameras were blinding. The paparazzi didn't know who she was, but they sensed power. Beatrice stepped out, her head held high, her back straight as a needle. Inside, the air smelled of expensive perfume and cold ambition. Gregory Ashford met her at the top of the marble stairs. He looked different, younger, energized. He wore the jacket she had fixed, a badge of honor in a room full of tuxedos that cost more than Beatrice's shop. "They're all waiting to meet the woman who said no to a billionaire," Gregory whispered, offering his arm. "Let them wait," Beatrice replied. I'm here to find the man who said yes to burning my home." The room shifted as they moved. Billionaires parted like the Red Sea. But in the corner, surrounded by a phalanx of silent men, sat Sterling Vance. He was older than Beatrice expected, with skin like parchment and eyes that looked like they had never seen a sunrise. He held a glass of scotch as if it were a weapon. As Beatrice approached, the conversation in the ballroom died down to a low hum. "Ms. Anderson," Sterling said, his voice a dry rasp, "I heard you had some trouble with the local youth recently. A shame. The Heights can be so unpredictable." "The only thing unpredictable in the Heights, Mr. Vance, is how much weight a person can carry before they decide to throw it back," Beatrice said, her voice steady, echoing through the silent circle of elites. Sterling smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've made quite an impression on Gregory, but investments are fickle. Today you're a muse. Tomorrow you're a tax write-off. My offer for your property stands. Triple the market value. Walk away now, and you can buy a life for your daughter where she never has to touch a needle again." Beatrice looked around the room. She saw the jewelry, the silk, the arrogance. She realized these people didn't see a neighborhood, they saw a ledger. "I didn't come here to sell, Sterling," Beatrice said, stepping into his personal space. "I came to deliver something." She reached into the hidden pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, digital recording device. The one Marcus had used to capture the audio from the bikers' helmets during the confrontation at the shop. "At 4:12 a.m. yesterday," Beatrice began, her voice gaining a dramatic intensity that forced the room to listen. "A man on a motorcycle said, 'The debt is still owed.' He mentioned a specific offshore account, one linked to a company called Vance Global Holdings." The color drained from Sterling's face. The circle of billionaires tightened, but this time they were looking at Sterling with suspicion. In their world, crime was fine, but getting caught was a sin. "You're bluffing," Sterling hissed. "I'm a tailor, Mr. Vance," Beatrice whispered, leaning in so only he could hear. "I know how to find the seams, and I know that when you pull one thread, the whole suit falls apart. That recording is already in the hands of the district attorney, but I didn't stop there." She turned to the room, raising her voice. "Tonight, I am announcing the formation of the Heights Land Trust. Using the investment from Mr. Ashford, we have purchased the titles to every building on my block. We aren't selling to developers. We are building a vocational center for the youth you call trouble. And the board of directors, it's chaired by the people who live there." The room erupted, not into applause, but into a chaotic roar of debate. Gregory Ashford beamed, raising his glass to Beatrice. Sterling Vance stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "You think you've won? You've just declared war on the people who run this city. You'll be crushed by the end of the week." "I was crushed when I was 20, when my mother died and left me with a shop and a mountain of debt," Beatrice said, her eyes flashing like steel. "I was crushed when the lights went out and I had to sew by candlelight to save a stranger. You can't crush someone who has already been through the fire. All you do is make them harder." Beatrice turned her back on the most powerful man in the room and walked toward the exit. She didn't stay for the lobster. She didn't stay for the dancing. As she walked down the red carpet, a young woman in a waitress uniform stopped her. She looked tired, her shoes worn out, just like Beatrice had been a week ago. "Ms. Anderson," the girl whispered, "is it true what you said in there?" Beatrice looked at the girl. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, the first one she had ever printed. "Come to the shop on Monday," Beatrice said. "We're hearing, and we're going to need people who know how to work when it's dark." But as Beatrice stepped into her car, she didn't see the black SUV following her. She didn't see the man in the front seat holding a phone, receiving a text that read, "Phase 2, If we can't buy her and we can't scare her, make her disappear. The driver of Beatrice's car took a sudden, sharp turn away from the heights. This isn't the way home, Beatrice said, her hand going to the door handle. Change of plans, ma'am, the driver said. He wasn't Gregory's driver, he was someone new. Mr. Vance wants a private word, somewhere quiet. The car sped toward the docks, the lights of the city fading into a cold, dark fog. The city lights were a ghost in the rearview mirror. Beatrice watched the neon pulse of the skyline fade until there was nothing left but the oppressive, wet darkness of the industrial waterfront. The car didn't stop at a warehouse or a luxury pier. It rolled to a halt in the shadow of a massive, derelict crane that looked like the skeleton of a prehistoric beast. End of the line, Ms. Anderson, the driver said. He didn't look back. He just clicked the child locks. Beatrice didn't panic. Panic was for people who had something left to lose. She felt the weight of the ceramic key in her pocket and the reinforced lining of her dress. She was a seamstress. She knew that every trap had a seam, and every seam could be ripped. The door was opened from the outside by a man whose face was a patchwork of scars and indifference. He dragged her out into the biting wind. There, standing on the edge of the pier, was Sterling Vance. He wasn't wearing his gala tuxedo anymore. He was in a long, charcoal overcoat, looking like the devil himself presiding over a kingdom of scrap metal. You have a very loud voice, Beatrice, Sterling said, the wind whipping his words into the dark. But out here, the only thing that hears you is the Atlantic, and the Atlantic is a very good listener. It never repeats a secret. You brought me all the way out here to talk about the weather, Sterling, Beatrice asked. Her voice didn't tremble. It was as sharp as a fresh blade. Sterling walked toward her, his shoes clicking on the wet wood. I brought you here to give you one last chance to be smart. That recording, the one you gave the DA, it won't stick. I own the DA, I own the judge. What I don't own is the narrative. He gestured to a small, heavy crate sitting on the edge of the pier. The world loves a hero, Sterling continued. But the world loves a fallen hero even more. Tomorrow's headline won't be about my offshore accounts. It will be about the saint of the heights who was found with $500,000 in laundered cash and a one-way ticket to the Caymans. You'll be a fraud, a thief who used Gregory Ashford's kindness to line her own pockets. Beatrice looked at the crate. It was a setup, a character assassination before the physical one. And when I refuse, she asked. Sterling sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. Then the Atlantic gets to hear your final prayer, and your daughter, Maya, is it? She'll be an orphan by sunrise. At the mention of Maya's name, something in Beatrice snapped. It wasn't fear. It was the absolute, crystalline clarity of a mother who realizes there is no longer a reason to play by the rules. You think you're the only one who knows how to use a shadow, Sterling, Beatrice whispered. The man with the scarred face moved to grab her arm, to force her toward the edge. But Beatrice didn't pull away. She leaned into him. Her hand flew to her collar, not to adjust her dress, but to pull the concealed industrial-grade wire she had sewn into the hem. In one fluid motion, the same motion she used to pull thread through heavy canvas, she looped the wire around the man's wrist and jerked. The reinforced fabric acted as a lever. The man, caught off guard by the strength of a woman who spent 14 hours a day pulling heavy machinery, stumbled. Beatrice didn't run. She shoved the man toward Sterling. I told you at the gala, Beatrice shouted over the wind. I'm a tailor. I know how things are held together. She reached into her hidden pocket and pulled out a small flare, the kind she kept in her shop for emergencies. She didn't point it at the men. She pointed it at the crate. PSHHH boom. The flare hit the crate, igniting the laundered cash and the dry wood. A pillar of red fire erupted on the pier, acting as a beacon that could be seen for miles. "What are you doing?" Sterling screamed, shielding his eyes. "You're burning the evidence." "No," Beatrice said, backing away toward the car. "I'm calling for a pickup." Suddenly, the dark water of the harbor was cut by a massive searchlight. It wasn't the police. It was a sleek, high-speed security vessel bearing the logo of the Ashford Global Group. Gregory Ashford hadn't just sent Beatrice to the gala with a dress. He had sent her with a GPS transponder sewn into the very shoulder pads she had reinforced. He knew Sterling would strike. He just didn't realize Beatrice would be the one to bait the trap. The boat roared toward the pier. The men in black suits on the deck weren't lawyers this time. They were tactical security. Sterling Vance looked at the fire, then at the approaching boat, and finally at Beatrice. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. "You think this ends here? I will burn your neighborhood to the ground." "You're welcome to try," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to that deep storyteller's rumble. "But remember what I said. My neighborhood is watching, and right now, they're watching you crawl." The security team swarmed the pier. Sterling and his men were forced to their knees, their hands behind their heads. The king of the city was being handled like a common criminal on a bed of wet rot and fish scales. Gregory Ashford stepped off the boat, his face grim. He walked over to Beatrice and draped his own heavy wool coat over her shoulders. "You're a dangerous woman, Beatrice Anderson," Gregory said, a hint of respect in his tired eyes. "I'm a mother from the heights, Gregory," she replied, looking at the fire as it died down to embers. "There's nothing more dangerous than that." But as they turned to leave, Julian Vane, the lawyer, stepped forward with a tablet. His face was pale. "Mr. Ashford, Ms. Anderson, we have a problem." "What now?" Gregory barked. "Sterling wasn't the only one after the property," Julian said, his voice trembling. "While we were out here, someone set fire to the shop. Maya was still inside." The world went silent. The sound of the waves, the wind, the sirens, it all vanished. Beatrice felt her heart stop. She didn't wait for the boat. She didn't wait for an explanation. She ran for the car. The car didn't just drive, it screamed. Beatrice sat in the passenger seat of Gregory's armored SUV, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the dark purple of the pre-dawn sky was being choked by a thick, oily orange glow. The Heights was burning. Her world, the street where she had taken her first steps, the shop where her mother had taught her that a needle was a tool of dignity, was being turned into an altar of ash. "Faster," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We're doing 80 in a 40 zone, Beatrice," the driver replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Then do 100. My daughter is in that building." As they rounded the final corner into her neighborhood, the sight was enough to stop her heart. The narrow street was filled with thick, black smoke that tasted of burning rubber and ancient wood. Fire trucks were struggling to navigate the narrow alleys blocked by fallen debris. And there, in the center of the chaos, was the Thorn Tailor shop. The first floor was a cage of orange light. The new Italian silk Gregory had sent was nothing more than fuel now, the expensive fabrics feeding the very fire meant to destroy them. But Beatrice wasn't looking at the fabric. She was looking at the second-story window. "Maya," she screamed, lunging out of the car before it had even fully stopped. The heat was a physical wall, pushing her back, singeing her hair. Firefighters tried to grab her, but Beatrice moved with a strength fueled by the purest adrenaline on earth. She slipped through their grip like a shadow. "Ma'am, stay back, the structure is unstable," a captain yelled. "My daughter is at that window," Beatrice pointed. Through the swirling smoke, a small, pale hand pressed against the glass of the bedroom. Maya was there, but the smoke was filling the room, a gray ghost rising from the floorboards. Beatrice looked at the front door. It was a roaring furnace. She looked at the fire escape. It had been cut, hanging uselessly 6 feet above reach. She remembered the construction on the adjacent lot Gregory had bought for her. A pile of heavy-duty industrial tarps lay near the sidewalk. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She grabbed the edge of the tarp, a massive, flame-retardant polymer used for high-rise protection. "Marcus, Samuel, help me," she roared. The men of the neighborhood, the ones who had watched her face down the bikers, didn't ask questions. They ran to her side. 6 men took the edges of the tarp, creating a makeshift life net beneath the window. "Maya, break the glass," Beatrice screamed. "Jump to me, baby, jump to me." Maya hesitated. The drop was 15 feet, and the smoke behind her was turning into a wall of flame. "I can't, Mom. I'm scared." "Look at me, Maya. Look at my eyes." Beatrice stood in the center of the street, the heat blistering her skin, her midnight blue gala dress charred and torn. "I have never let you fall. I am not starting today. Jump." With a scream that was lost in the roar of the fire, Maya shattered the window with a chair and leaped. For a second, time didn't just slow down, it stopped. The girl hung in the air, a silhouette against the inferno. Then, with a sickening thud and the collective groan of 6 men, the tarp caught her. Beatrice dived onto the tarp, pulling her daughter into her arms, covering her with her own body as the glass from the windows began to explode outward. They rolled onto the asphalt just as a massive groan echoed through the street. The roof of the Tailor shop collapsed. The sign, the one with her mother's name, melted and fell into the glowing embers. Beatrice held Maya so tight she could feel the girl's heart beating against her own. They were alive. They were safe. But as she looked up at the ruins of her life, she saw a figure standing at the end of the alley. It wasn't a biker. It wasn't Sterling Vance. It was a man in a plain gray suit holding a tablet. He wasn't watching the fire. He was recording the reaction. Beatrice stood up, her face covered in soot, her expensive dress ruined, her hands bleeding. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a survivor who had just found her target. "You missed," she said, her voice a low, terrifying growl that carried over the sound of the sirens. The man in the suit flinched. He realized that by burning the shop, they hadn't destroyed Beatrice Anderson. They had stripped away her last reason to be merciful. Gregory Ashford arrived minutes later, his face ashen as he looked at the ruins. "Beatrice, I am so sorry. I'll rebuild it. I'll make it 10 times bigger." Beatrice didn't look at him. She looked at the people of the Heights who were standing in the street. Mrs. Lopez, Mr. Samuel, the kids who had nowhere to go. They were looking at her for a sign. "Don't rebuild the shop, Gregory," Beatrice said, her voice cold and hard as diamond. "What? Why?" "Because a shop is just a building, and as long as Sterling Vance is breathing free air, no building is safe." She turned to face him, the fire reflecting in her eyes. "You told me you have the best lawyers, the best investigators, and the best connections in the world. Use them. Tonight we don't fix suits. Tonight we dismantle an empire." She looked at the man in the gray suit, who was trying to slip away into the shadows. "And start with him," she pointed. "He has the footage of who started the fire, and by sunrise I want him to tell the world exactly who paid for the matches." As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a long, bloody shadow over the ruins of the Heights, Beatrice Anderson didn't look back at what she had lost. She looked forward to the reckoning she was about to deliver. The tailor was finished sewing. It was time to start cutting. The sun rose over the Heights not with a shimmer, but with a glare. Beatrice Anderson stood in the middle of the street, the smoke from her ruined shop still curling around her ankles like a dying animal. She was still wearing the midnight blue gala dress, torn, soot-stained, and smelling of fire. But as she watched the investigators haul the man in the gray suit into an unmarked car, she didn't look like a victim of an arson. She looked like the architect of a new world. By 10:00 a.m., the block was no longer a crime scene. It was a courtroom. Gregory Ashford had moved with the speed of a man who finally understood that his wealth was a weapon, not just a score. His legal team had frozen every asset linked to Vance Global Holdings. The recording Beatrice had made at the docks, combined with the metadata from the arsonist's tablet, had created a noose that even Sterling Vance's millions couldn't loosen. Sterling wasn't arrested in a boardroom. He was arrested at the airport, trying to board a private jet to a country with no extradition treaty. The image of the Titan of Wall Street in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face pale with shock, was beamed to every screen in the country. But the real story wasn't the billionaire's fall. It was what happened next. Beatrice walked to the center of the debris where her front door used to be. She reached into the ash and pulled out something small, blackened, and heavy. It was her mother's 1984 Singer sewing machine. The plastic was melted, the belt was snapped, but the cast iron frame was still there, unbroken. "It's gone, Mom," Maya whispered, standing beside her. "Everything we worked for." Beatrice looked at her daughter, then at the crowd of neighbors who were gathered behind the yellow tape. Mrs. Lopez was there. Mr. Samuel was there. Marcus was there. And behind them were hundreds of others, people from 3 blocks away who had heard the story of the woman who said no to a bribe and yes to her soul. "No, Maya," Beatrice said, her voice echoing with a deep, resonant authority. "The shop was just the shell, the business. That's right here." She touched her own heart, then Maya's. Gregory Ashford stepped forward, holding a folder. "Beatrice, the insurance payout will be 3 times the value, and I've already secured a temporary space downtown. The Vogue contract is still yours. You can leave this all behind." Beatrice looked at the towering glass skyscrapers in the distance, then back at the cracked sidewalks of the Heights. "I'm not going downtown, Gregory," she said. The crowd went silent. "I'm staying right here," Beatrice continued. "We're going to rebuild, but we aren't just rebuilding a tailor shop. We're building the Thorne Legacy Center. We're going to teach every kid on this block how to sew, how to code, and how to stand their ground. You wanted to invest in me, Gregory. Invest in them." Gregory Ashford looked at the faces of the people in the Heights, the unpredictable people Sterling Vance wanted to erase. He saw the fire in their eyes, the same fire he had seen in Beatrice's shop during the blackout. "Consider it done," Gregory said. A year later. The new building didn't look like a fortress. It was made of glass and light, designed to reflect the sunrise. Above the door, the sign didn't say Tailor Shop. It said, "The Seam of the City." Beatrice sat at a new machine, not the industrial Juki, but her mother's old iron Singer, fully restored and polished until it shone like a diamond. She was finishing a suit for a young man from the block who had just landed an internship at NASA. She didn't charge him a dime. "You need a miracle today, not a bill," she told him, echoing the words her mother had said decades ago. As the young man left, Beatrice looked at a framed photo on the wall. It was the midnight blue dress she had worn to the gala, still stained with soot, preserved behind glass. It was a reminder that you don't have to be clean to be powerful. You just have to be unbreakable. Gregory Ashford walked in, looking at the bustling center filled with teenagers learning the trade. "The board wants to know if you'll design the uniforms for the new Olympic team, Beatrice." Beatrice smiled, her hands never stopping their rhythmic movement. "Tell them I'll think about it. I have a neighborhood to dress first." Beatrice Anderson didn't wait for permission to be kind. She didn't calculate the return on investment. She just said yes to a stranger when everything in her life screamed no. And it changed everything. Not because she was special, but because she chose to be decent. You have that same power. Right now, today, someone in your life is desperate. They need a yes when everyone else says no. Your kindness might not make headlines, but it might change a life. Beatrice said no to $2,000 and gained a legacy that money can't buy. What could you gain by choosing kindness today? If this story moved you, share it. Someone needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Beatrice's position? Like this video if you believe integrity still matters, and subscribe to join our community of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Because the world changes one choice at a time, one stitch at a time.